October 1944. The rain never stopped. Across the fields of western Germany, the American First Army closed in on Aachen, the first German city to face invasion since Napoleon. Its ancient spires and cobbled streets now formed a fortress. Behind every stone arch and basement window waited the veterans of the Wehrmacht, ordered to hold to the last man. By dawn, the city was wrapped in a grey silence. Then the silence broke. From the outskirts, batteries of 105mm M2 howitzers opened fire, their muzzles flashing through the mist. Each gun weighed over 2 tons, dragged forward by half-tracks through mud that swallowed their wheels. At first, the range was proper, the angles clean. But as infantry crept closer and tanks jammed the narrow lanes, the gunners followed, dragging their pieces block by block, until the artillery of a continent was firing point-blank down medieval streets. Every blast tore open walls that had stood for centuries. Stone turned to dust, dust turned to fog. The air itself seemed to scream. German soldiers later called it Höllenfeuer, artillery hell. The old churches crumbled, the Gothic facades that once held emperors' coronations vanished beneath the American barrage. Civilians huddled in cellars, counting seconds between explosions, praying not to hear the next one land above them. For the men behind the guns, there was no triumph, only precision. They loaded shells with the rhythm of machinery, hands blackened by powder, eyes fixed on the breach ahead. Between salvos, someone lit a cigarette, its ember flickering against the drizzle. Then the next command. Fire. The recoil jolted through the mud, and another section of Aachen folded inward. To the infantry, those guns were salvation. Nothing else could shatter the German bunkers or break the walls that tanks could not breach. Each concussion cleared another few yards of ruin, another step toward the heart of the Reich. By nightfall, Aachen was a city of smoke and echoes, and through that ruin, the M2 howitzer had written its name, not as a weapon of glory, but of necessity. In the distance, another city waited behind its walls. It did not begin with fanfare. The M2 howitzer was not the child of crisis, but of preparation. Designed quietly in the 1930s, when America still believed the Great War had ended all wars. It was a peacetime weapon built by men who understood that peace rarely lasts. Forged in the foundries of Rock Island and Watervliet, it was neither elegant nor revolutionary, but it worked. By the time the world burned again, the M2 was already old. In 1939, military journals wrote of mobile armor and strategic air power. The future, they said, belonged to tanks, planes, and speed. No one wrote of field guns. No one photographed the men who fed them. When parades rolled down Pennsylvania Avenue, the howitzer stood at the back, its barrel muted, its shape too familiar to inspire wonder. Yet when the shooting began, it was this forgotten gun that spoke the loudest. In Tunisia's rocky hills, in the dust of Anzio, across the hedgerows of Normandy, the same silhouette appeared. A squat cannon, its wheels caked in earth, its crew crouched close against the recoil. They fired until the barrels glowed and the air trembled. The tanks might have captured headlines, the bombers might have won newsreels, but the M2 was the one that never rested. From North Africa to Berlin, it was the Army's most used field piece, its steel echo following every advance. It had no romance, only trust. Wherever the infantry went, the howitzer followed. When tanks bogged down, when radio calls failed, when the rain drowned hope, the soldiers knew that somewhere behind them, the gunners were still at work. They were the steady heartbeat of the battlefield, measured, dependable, unseen. While other nations raced toward innovation, jet engines, rockets, dreams of the future, America perfected what it already had. Each refinement of the M2 was small, deliberate, invisible to those who did not depend on it. But within that simplicity lay something indestructible, a weapon that always fired when it was needed. It never dazzled, it never failed, and soon its unassuming strength would face the strongest walls of Europe. In 1940, America was not yet at war. The newspapers spoke of Europe's collapse, of London's firelit nights, of nations erased in weeks. But across the Atlantic, the United States still stood apart, uneasy, watching, industrial smoke rising against a sky that did not yet echo with bombs. Inside the great factories of Illinois and New York, men worked under fluorescent light, turning iron and oil into something the world would soon need in terrible quantity. At Rock Island Arsenal, along the Mississippi, the clang of steel was relentless. The machines carved, drilled, and milled, transforming raw metal into the exact geometry of the 105mm M2 Howitzer. At Watervliet, in upstate New York, the air shimmered with heat as barrels were rifled by hand and tested by engineers who understood that in war, precision was mercy. Each barrel had to be perfect. A fraction of error meant death at the other end. In these quiet workshops, America's philosophy of war took shape, not through invention, but through repetition. Every gun identical, every shell interchangeable. The system was the secret. The howitzer did not rely on genius or improvisation. It relied on the unbroken rhythm of men and machines. Production became belief, consistency its creed. In an age of chaos, this was America's order. The result was a weapon not of glamour, but of reliability. By 1941, the M2 was being produced faster than the army could train the men to fire it. It was the quiet backbone of a force still forming, the assurance that when soldiers finally went overseas, their artillery would never run dry. Each crate, each barrel, each round spoke of foresight in a nation that was not yet fighting, but already preparing to endure. As Europe burned, the American cannon waited, silent in its crates, patient in its purpose. When the call came, when the first American troops landed in North Africa and the sound of battle reached across the ocean, the M2 would already be ready, and in the deserts ahead, its voice would finally be heard. Before the first shot was fired, the theorists had already declared what the next war would look like. To them, it would be a war of movement, of engines and wings, of machines that erased the slowness of the past. The lessons of the trenches were dismissed as the relics of a dead century. The tank, they said, was the new god of the battlefield, the airplane its prophet. In lecture halls and briefings across London and Washington, planners spoke of momentum, not endurance. They imagined a lightning war that would move too fast for artillery to matter. Guns that had once shaped empires were now considered baggage, too heavy, too old, too slow. The future, it seemed, belonged to the armored spearhead and the air raid, yet beneath the surface of this optimism, a quieter truth remained. The veterans of 1918 remembered something the theorists did not. They remembered how every attack, no matter how daring, ended against the earth, against concrete, wire, and men dug deep enough to wait it out. They knew that in the end, victory was not about who moved first, but who could place steel where it mattered most, again and again, until the ground itself surrendered. In the American ranks, the M2 howitzer waited in silence. To the untrained eye, it was nothing remarkable. A short barrel, a simple carriage, a tool for others to use once the real fighting began. It stood at the edge of war games, ignored by officers who believed that speed was strategy. Even as factories produced thousands, the gun remained a supporting actor in the great drama of mobility. Across the ocean, The Germans built a faith around motion. Their doctrine, Blitzkrieg, was a creed of aggression, of tanks moving faster than thought, of aircraft striking before the enemy could aim. They called their artillery the accompaniment, not the lead. They spoke of rhythm, not range. And when they looked westward, they mocked the Allies' slower guns, calling them Die Kanonen des Zögerns, the guns of hesitation. But steel is patient. When the Blitz met the battlefield, when the tanks outran their supply lines and the skies filled with smoke, it was the guns that endured. The M2 did not need speed. It needed only coordinates. From miles away, it could shatter a column, silence a battery, or reduce a bunker to dust before the infantry ever saw it. Its power lay not in movement, but in certainty, in knowing exactly where to strike and never missing twice. In time, the myth of mobility would meet the reality of fire. For while tanks could surprise and aircraft could terrify, only artillery could endure. And as the storm of 1944 drew nearer, those who once mocked the guns of hesitation would learn that patience, too, could kill, faster than speed and with far greater permanence. Soon, the world would hear what patience sounded like. It was never meant to be beautiful. The M2 Howitzer was the kind of weapon that drew no admiration in parades, no fascination from foreign attachés. Its form was purely functional, a barrel, a carriage, and the machinery of recoil. To an artist, it was uninspired. To a soldier, it was perfect. Its design spoke the language of utility. A split-trail carriage that could open wide for stability and close for transport. A hydro-pneumatic recoil system that absorbed the shock without tearing itself apart, and a 105mm shell, heavy enough to break bunkers, light enough to move with the infantry. Every line of its construction was guided by a single thought: make it work every time, under any condition. The balance was uncanny. At just over 2 tons, the M2 could be towed by a standard truck, manhandled into position by its crew, and made ready to fire in minutes. It could deliver 6 rounds a minute to a target 9 miles away, the shells rising in a slow arc before falling with mathematical precision. To the men who built it, it was the harmony between weight, power, and reach, an instrument tuned for the sound of war. The engineers who refined it used a quiet phrase, soldier-proof. It meant a weapon that forgave mistakes, that endured abuse, that could still fire after being dropped in mud or frozen in snow. In an army that stretched across oceans, simplicity was not just convenience, it was survival. A gun that could be fixed with a wrench and fired by any trained crew was worth more than any theoretical marvel that failed in the field. In an age obsessed with innovation, the M2's genius lay in restraint. It did not chase range records or mechanical novelty. It achieved something rarer: dependability. Each improvement was small, deliberate. A stronger breech, a smoother elevation gear, a sturdier recoil spring. The gun was not evolving toward perfection. It had begun near enough to it. It was, by every technical comparison, unremarkable. The British 25-pounder fired faster. The German LEFH-18 shot farther. But few guns combined their virtues as the M2 did. It was neither fragile nor excessive, the golden mean of artillery, designed not for glory, but for the work of war. Its greatness would never be measured in blueprints or test reports, but in the silence that followed its fire, the kind of silence that meant the line had held, the enemy had withdrawn, and men who might have died were still alive. In the end, the M2 was not the triumph of brilliance, but of wisdom. The wisdom to know that war rewards what endures, and soon that endurance would face its trial, in mud, in rain, and in fire. The proving ground was waiting. By 1943, Europe had become a fortress. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of the Siegfried Line, the Wehrmacht reshaped the continent into a labyrinth of concrete and steel. Pillboxes crowned the hills, bunkers burrowed beneath towns. Each river crossing, each valley, each city became a defensive web, interlocked, overlapping, waiting for an invader who would be forced to pay for every meter in blood. The German command believed in fortification as both shield and symbol. To them, walls were the language of permanence, proof that the Reich could hold what it had taken. They poured millions of tons of cement into the Atlantic Wall and the West Wall alike, confident that no artillery in the world could breach them before the defenders struck back. In their doctrine, the tank might break through, but the gun could never break in. They studied Allied weapons and dismissed them. The American 105mm or M2, they noted, was a standard field piece, designed for open battle, not siege. Against reinforced concrete, they calculated, its shell would chip, not crumble. Against bunkers, it would wound, not destroy. To the officers in Aachen, Metz, and the Ruhr, it was another echo of the old war. Too small, too ordinary, too late. What they underestimated was not the weapon, but the will behind it. By the time the M2's barrels were pointed east, the U.S. Army had learned the art of mobility. Artillery was no longer static fire from distant hills. It was a living network, moving with the infantry, coordinating by radio, striking and shifting before the enemy could answer. The gunners could call, fire, and relocate within minutes. To the Germans, it felt less like bombardment and more like a tide. Precise, invisible, unstoppable. Each shell carried more than explosives. It carried adaptation. American fire direction centers calculated trajectories faster than ever before, adjusting for terrain, weather, and counterfire in seconds. Batteries overlapped ranges so that the moment one crew ceased fire, another began, the rhythm unbroken. When stone resisted, they changed angles. When bunkers endured, they found the air vents. The M2 was no longer a single gun, but an organism, flexible, reactive, alive. In war, strength without movement is fragility. The Germans had built for endurance. The Americans fought for agility. As their walls stood firm, the artillery learned to flow around them, to probe their edges, to turn rigidity into target. The very thing that made those fortresses seem invincible, their immobility, made them perfect for destruction. The test would come soon enough. On the western frontier, where medieval stone met industrial firepower, the M2 would be asked to do the impossible. Bring down a fortress without moving an inch closer, and in the smoke above Aachen, the world would learn that even walls can die. North Africa, 1942. The war had come not in the forests or the cities the Americans had imagined, but in the open, a sea of dust and distance. The desert was silent until it wasn't, its horizon flashing like a forge each time the guns spoke. For the young crews of the M2 Howitzer, this was the first test, not of steel, but of understanding. The enemy was not only the Wehrmacht, it was the land itself. Wind warped the trajectory of shells. Heat shimmered the air, bending sightlines and calculations. Sand crawled into gears, into fuses, into lungs. Maps meant little when landmarks vanished by midday. To fire in such a place was to aim at ghosts. The gunners quickly discovered that the greatest danger came not from German counterfire, but from their own inexperience. Shells falling short, ranging too far, scattering across the nothingness of the Sahara. Each failure was written down. Battery commanders turned mistakes into data, and data into doctrine. When one crew overshot an enemy column by a mile, the error was logged, studied, and corrected. They learned to adjust for the heat of the barrel, the weight of the wind, the subtle pull of the earth itself. Every misfire became a lesson in humility, a reminder that precision had to be earned, not assumed. Over time, the chaos began to shape itself into pattern. Forward observers, perched on dunes or half buried in rock, called corrections over crackling radios. Their eyes became extensions of the gun, translating sight into numbers, numbers into destruction. Behind them, plotting rooms grew more disciplined. Wooden tables were covered in grid maps, compasses, and range tables marked with sweat and pencil dust. The gunners no longer aimed by instinct, they aimed by equation. The network expanded. By late 1942, entire fields of guns were connected by radio. Each battery aware of the other's fire, each observer linked through miles of static. The American artillery arm, once scattered and slow, became a coordinated organism. Orders were spoken in clipped syllables, times synchronized to the second. A single forward observer could direct the fire of 20 guns, unseen, from miles away. Mathematics became muscle memory. Each crew moved as one, sighting, loading, firing, adjusting, reloading. The rhythm mechanical, yet human, the sound of precision replacing the chaos of guesswork. Range tables became as familiar as scripture. They could calculate drift and drop faster than a clock could tick. In a desert that defeated compasses and punished pride, the M2 became a weapon of discipline, not instinct. And with that discipline came revelation. The soldiers began to see their own craft differently. Artillery was no longer the brute roar behind the infantry. It was intelligence, foresight, and coordination given physical form. The gunners learned to think beyond what they could see. They fired at coordinates, not targets, at mathematics, not men. It was warfare detached from sight, a kind of invisible architecture of destruction, built in silence, executed in thunder. When the campaign reached Tunisia, the transformation was complete. American artillery, once hesitant, had become confident, almost serene. Fire missions that once took minutes now took seconds. The first shell landed close, the second closer still, the third on target. Entire German battalions were pinned by guns they could not locate, answering a foe they could not see. Rommel's staff officers began to note it in their reports. The American artillery reacts faster than expected, but behind that efficiency lay something deeper, a new kind of warfare taking shape. The M2 had taught its crews not just how to destroy, but how to think. They had learned that war was no longer a contest of strength alone, but of systems, of how quickly information could become fire. It was a quiet revolution, unfolding one calculation at a time. By the end of the North African campaign, the Americans had not yet perfected the art of war, but they had understood its new language. Artillery had become intelligence, fire had become thought, and soon that thought would move north, across the Mediterranean, toward the cities where precision would matter even more than power. The desert had been their classroom. Europe would be their exam. Sicily, 1943. The war had left the desert and entered the continent again, into valleys, olive groves, and stone towns where echoes carried longer than life itself. The Americans landed first under a white sun and a sky full of dust. The M2 Howitzer followed, drawn ashore by engines and rope, its wheels sinking into the sand of yet another foreign shore. By now, the gunners were no longer amateurs. They had learned in Africa what no classroom could teach, that artillery was not simply destruction, it was choreography. In Sicily's narrow ridges and steep gorges, they would refine that art into something almost musical. When the batteries opened fire, they did not sound chaotic. They sounded orchestrated. Dozens of M2s, hidden behind hills or among vineyards, fired in sequence, then in unison, until the sound no longer seemed like separate guns, but a single continuous resonance, a rolling thunder that folded into itself. Each gunner knew his measure, his timing, his place in the score. The shells arrived on target not one after another, but all at once. It was called time on target. The principle was simple, the effect devastating. Observers calculated the distance of each battery from the enemy position. Those farthest away fired first, those nearest fired last, so that all shells, traveling at different speeds over different ranges, struck the same coordinates at the same second. The result was not a barrage, it was revelation. To those beneath it, there was no warning, only instant catastrophe. Infantrymen described it as if the sky had turned solid. Walls dissolved in bursts of white dust, trees vanished in waves of air. The enemy's first hint of danger was the last sound they ever heard, the whistle of impact. To the soldiers advancing behind the bombardment, it looked as if invisible hands were clearing the earth for them, brushing aside what had been obstacles minutes before. German officers were stunned. Their reports spoke with equal parts awe and confusion. Feuer wie ein Sturm aus Uhren, fire like a storm made of clocks. They noted that the American artillery no longer behaved like individual batteries, but as a single machine, too fast, too exact, too synchronized to be improvised. It was a new language of warfare, spoken fluently by men who months earlier had barely known how to aim. Behind the rhythm was mathematics. Every shot was timed to the second, its flight predicted by calculation, its impact shaped by weather, wind, and elevation. But beyond numbers lay instinct, the quiet, unspoken understanding among crews who trusted their instruments, their comrades, and their craft. They fired not in chaos, but in cadence. Every lanyard pulled at the perfect moment. It was not merely bombardment, it was performance, and like music, it required harmony. The fire direction centers became conductors, issuing coordinates, adjusting angles, keeping tempo. The gunners were the musicians, reading the data like notes, transforming mathematics into thunder. When all worked together, the sound became something almost transcendent. The mechanical precision of war turned into the emotional certainty of victory. In the hills of Italy, where villages clung to cliffs and battles were measured in yards, the M2 became the voice of inevitability. German troops who once mocked the slow guns of America now faced barrages that arrived before they could retreat, that followed them even when they moved, that seemed to know the terrain better than they did. The gun had become more than a weapon. It was a language of coordination, spoken fluently by an army that had learned to think in unison. And as the front moved north, toward Monte Cassino, toward Rome, the music only grew louder, each salvo more synchronized, each plan more intricate. The orchestra of fire was reaching its crescendo, but in the distance beyond the Apennines, new walls waited, and they would not fall so easily. Behind every cannon, there were 9 men, 9 lives moving as one: loaders, gunners, fuse setters, range finders, the section chief. Each had a task as narrow as the space between heartbeats, each trusting that the others would complete theirs. Together, they formed a living mechanism of flesh and will, the human machine that made the M2 more than steel. Their days began before dawn, when the mist was still gray and the air tasted of oil. The gun stood ready, dark against the horizon, its barrel slick with dew. Around it, the crew moved with quiet precision. One man checked the breech block, another stacked the shells, each one weighing 33 pounds, marked and fused according to the day's orders. When the command came, "Fire mission!" the silence vanished, hands blurred, muscles locked, voices called numbers. The process was mechanical, but never mindless. One man adjusted the elevation wheel by fractions of a degree. Another rammed the shell home with the exact pressure required. The gunner watched through the sight, whispering corrections. The chief gave the order. Fire! The recoil jolted through the trail into the earth. A brief, violent heartbeat. Then again, and again, 6 times a minute when the tempo demanded it. They lived beside the gun as if it were a creature that needed tending. In rain, they covered it with canvas. In snow, they heated the breech with fuel tablets. When food was scarce, they ate cold rations beside its wheel. When sleep was possible, they lay in its shadow, their helmets tilted over their eyes. The M2 was not simply their tool. It was their companion, their shelter, their one constant in a war that moved without mercy. They gave it names. Some called it Old Reliable, others Katie or the Mule. One battery in Italy painted a single line on its barrel after every 100 rounds. By Casino, there were too many lines to count. The crews trusted their gun as they trusted one another. It had never failed them. It had fired through mud, through sleet, through bombardments that buried it to its axle. When other weapons jammed or cracked, the M2 still answered the call. They joked to keep from thinking too much. Artillerymen don't fight Germans, they said. We fight gravity. The line always earned a tired laugh, because it was true. Their enemy was not a uniform or a face, but a calculation, the endless fight against wind, weight, and distance. Each shell was a negotiation with physics, a promise to the infantry miles ahead that they were not forgotten. Fatigue was constant, but discipline outlasted it. Their ears rang, their hands bled, their backs ached from loading, but the work never slowed. Even in the dark, even after days without sleep, the rhythm remained. They knew that if one man faltered, the line would falter. Precision was survival. Routine was mercy. Over time, the bond between men and machine blurred. The gun became part of them. Its sound a pulse they could feel even at rest. Its recoil a memory imprinted in bone. They could tell by the vibration of the trail whether the shot had been good. They could smell the powder and know when the barrel was close to overheating. To outsiders, the M2 was an object of iron. To those who served it, it was alive, loud, loyal, and utterly dependable. And when the fighting paused, when the echoes drifted away and the horizon lay silent, the crew would sit beside it, 9 men around their brother of steel, and wait for the next call, because they knew it would come. And somewhere ahead, beyond sight and smoke, others were waiting for their next round to fall. Soon, the gun and its crew would face a new kind of silence, one born not of distance, but of ruin. June 7th, 1944. D-Day +1. The beaches still smoked, the tide was red with rusted landing craft, and the sand trembled under the sound of a war still unfolding. Along the narrow lanes of Omaha and Utah, the M2 Howitzers arrived, towed through surf, mud, and wreckage, their crews waist-deep in water, dragging the barrels of their guns like oars through a storm. It was chaos made solid. Shells fell short. Mortars whined overhead. Men pushed forward through shattered dunes, hauling wheels that sank into the sand with every turn. Some guns were hit before they could fire a single round. Others were buried in the tide. But those that made it ashore, those that found a patch of ground firm enough to hold, began their work before the sea had even calmed. Within hours, the first American artillery was operational on French soil. Gun crews dug shallow pits into the mud behind the beachhead, setting up their pieces by compass and instinct. Ammunition came in on stretchers, carried by men who hours earlier had been medics. The first fire missions were blind. Maps were incomplete, radios unreliable, observers scattered. But the gunners fired anyway. Each round was a statement. "We are here and we will stay." By midday, their range expanded inland. The German batteries hidden beyond the hedgerows opened up, pounding the beachhead with methodical precision. Counterfire followed. From the dunes near Colville and Vierville, the M2s answered, their muzzles rising and falling in steady rhythm. Dust mixed with the salt air. Each concussion echoed against the low French hills. Slowly, one by one, the German guns fell silent. By afternoon, the advance began in earnest. The hedgerows, ancient, tangled walls of earth and roots, turned the countryside into a maze. Tanks could not maneuver, and infantry could not see more than 50 yards ahead. The battlefield shrank into fragments, but artillery could still see the map whole. Every field became a range, every intersection a coordinate. The M2s learned to fire at angles so steep that their shells dropped almost vertically, turning the hedgerows themselves into cages. Observers hidden in church towers or crouched in farmhouses whispered coordinates over radio. Here, add 50, left 20, fire for effect. The words were clinical, almost gentle, and then the sky erupted. The howitzers answered in perfect sequence, their timing honed through years of repetition. 6 rounds a minute, 9 miles of reach. The shells arced through the clouds, unseen until they arrived, shattering strongpoints the infantry could not reach. The men who once joked that they fought gravity now commanded it. By nightfall, the fields of Normandy belonged to the guns. The M2s spoke continuously, a language of thunder. Some crews fired over 1,500 rounds in a single day, the barrels glowing red in the dark, cooled only by the drizzle that drifted in from the channel. The sound became the heartbeat of the invasion, the steady pulse of control amid chaos. When infantry faltered, the guns steadied them. When armor bogged down, the guns cleared the path. And when German counterattacks came through the mist, they dissolved beneath invisible walls of fire. German prisoners later said they never saw the Americans, only heard them. They spoke of walls of explosions, of fields that vanished, of command posts erased without warning. One captured officer wrote simply, "They fire faster than we can think." The next morning, the beaches were quiet again, but inland the thunder moved, through bocage and orchard, over roads lined with wrecked half-tracks and smoke. The artillery rolled forward, dragging its guns, laying new positions, striking targets miles ahead of the infantry it guarded. The battlefield was no longer a contest of movement, but of mind. The M2 had turned war into geometry, an equation solved in real time by men who measured their survival in degrees and seconds. By the third day, the American advance stretched miles inland. Behind every platoon, a battery waited, already calculating. Behind every battery, another stood ready to move. The front was no longer a line, it was a network, pulsing with data, radio, and trust. The M2 Howitzer had become the quiet conductor of the Allied invasion, unseen, but everywhere. When the smoke lifted over Normandy, it was not tanks that defined the field, but the patient rhythm of artillery. Mobility had given way to calculation, improvisation to precision. The future of modern warfare had arrived, not with a charge but with a compass, a range table, and a crew that never stopped firing. And beyond the hedgerows, the guns were already turning east, toward the heart of Germany itself. November 1944. The rain came first, cold, persistent, unending. Then came the mud, thick as grief, swallowing boots, wheels, and hope alike. In that grey landscape stood Metz, a fortress city older than memory, its walls layered by generations who believed stone could defy time itself. Behind its bastions, the German garrison waited, a disciplined, defiant force determined to make the Americans bleed for every street. Metz was not just another city. It was a relic of Europe's obsession with permanence, built by the Romans, expanded by Charlemagne, reforged by the French, and reinforced by the Kaiser. It had endured empire after empire. Now it stood as the western gate of the Reich, surrounded by concentric rings of forts, 86 in total, each armed, each overlapping, each bound by concrete thicker than the hull of a battleship. To those inside, it was impregnable. To those outside, it looked eternal. The first assaults came from the air. Wave after wave of bombers crossed the clouds, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance. But when the smoke cleared, Metz still stood. The bombs scarred the earth, but left the ramparts whole. Then came the armor, Shermans grinding through mud, firing point-blank into the parapets. Their shells bounced off stone built for sieges before gunpowder. Tanks bogged down in the marshes, their engines choking in the rain. The fortress held, and the city mocked modern war with ancient patience. So the Americans changed their language. If air could not crush it, and armor could not pierce it, then they would use calculation. The M2 howitzers, built for open battle, were dragged forward by hand, yard by yard, through knee-deep sludge. The gunners dug in within sight of the walls, closer than doctrine allowed, closer than sanity suggested. Then, in the dim light of dawn, they began to fire. Each round struck with the rhythm of inevitability. The 100mm shells hit low, at the base of the ramparts, where centuries of masonry met the soaked ground. The stone shuddered, cracked, and fell away in sheets. When the Germans repaired the breaches by night, the Americans adjusted their calculations by morning. The range tables grew crowded with scribbles, distances, wind speeds, angles of descent. The gunners did not shout. They murmured numbers. The siege had become a classroom for the men inside Metz. It was not the noise that broke them, but the constancy. The M2s fired without pause, through day, through night, through rain. When one battery rested, another took its place. The guns did not sleep, did not tire, did not wait for weather or mercy. German officers began to call them der Feind, der nie schläft, the enemy that never sleeps. Their strongholds, once symbols of eternity, began to crumble under arithmetic. The precision was surgical. Observers mapped the city's grid from ruined bell towers, marking each fortress and casemate. Fire missions were timed so that every gun along the Moselle River struck its mark within seconds of the others. The shells landed in overlapping rhythms. Walls collapsed, tunnels caved, and silence followed only long enough to confirm the hit. Metz was not conquered by firepower alone, but by coordination, by the invisible order of calculation. To the infantry, watching from the mud, it was unreal. Where tanks had stalled, the guns advanced the front. Every explosion reshaped the city. Fire became architecture, unbuilding what centuries had made. Churches cracked open, rail lines split, moats filled with debris. For the first time since the war began, the enemy's greatest defenses were not defeated by force, but by thought. When Metz finally fell on November 22nd, it was not taken. It was solved. The American artillery had turned the fortress into an equation and found its answer. The defenders surrendered in disbelief, their bunkers still smoking, their walls reduced to rubble that no longer meant resistance. For them, the war had changed shape. It was no longer about who possessed the heaviest armor or the boldest attack, but who could think faster, calculate cleaner, and strike without pause. After Metz, the Wehrmacht's reports began to read differently. They no longer feared the tank columns or the bombers in the clouds. They feared the mathematics, the quiet, unrelenting rhythm that arrived before dawn and ended only with the fall of the city. And beyond the ruins of Metz, that rhythm was already moving east, toward the Rhine, toward the heart of Germany, toward the silence yet to come. March 1945. After 5 years of fire, the Western Front had reached the Rhine, the last great river between the Allied armies and the heart of Germany. Its waters were black with spring thaw, wide as memory, flowing eastward toward the ruins of cities already burning. For the Americans who reached its western bank, it was both a victory and a warning. Across that water waited the Reich's final defense and the last cost of the war. The engineers came first, silent in the dark, hauling pontoon sections to the river's edge. Behind them, the guns assembled. Rows of M2 Howitzers stood hub to hub, their barrels angled low over the current. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and cities to reach this point, and now they would bridge a river not with steel, but with fire. The order was simple: protect the crossings, whatever the cost. When the first salvos began, the Rhine lit up like glass. Each flash from the batteries along the west bank reflected on the water's surface. Light and steel intertwined. The river transformed into a mirror of war. The shells arced overhead in graceful succession, whistling across the darkness before striking the far shore. To the Germans in the ruins of Remagen, Wesel, and Oppenheim, it seemed as though the sky itself had turned against them. The engineers worked beneath that storm. Spotlights were forbidden. Only the intermittent light of explosions guided their hands. They moved like shadows, bolting planks, anchoring pontoons, tightening cables that strained with every current. When enemy fire found them, the M2s answered instantly, blanketing the opposite bank in thunder until the return fire fell silent again. In the space between blasts, the sound of hammering could be heard, the quiet defiance of men building a bridge beneath a falling sky. Every bridgehead was bought not by assault, but by calculation. The M2s adjusted their ranges with mathematical precision, mapping every bend, every slope, every unseen bunker. By dawn, entire corridors of safety existed only because the artillery had erased everything that threatened them. For once, progress was measured not in casualties, but in coordinates. The shells did the dying, the men did the crossing. As the first pontoon bridges took shape, tanks and trucks rolled across, their treads humming against the temporary decks. Infantry followed, hunched under the mist, rifles wrapped against the spray. Each man looked up as he passed beneath the arcs of shellfire, watching the trails of light vanish into fog. 1,000 burning paths, drawn across the night by the same patient guns that had carried them from Africa to here. By morning, the Rhine was no longer a barrier, it was a road. On the east bank, the last German defenses broke apart under the weight of unending precision. The M2s shifted their aim inland, supporting the breakout toward the Ruhr. The rhythm was unchanging. Fire, move, fire again. The gunners, sleepless and deafened, packed up their guns and followed the bridges they had protected, their boots crunching through brass casings that gleamed like coins in the dawn. To the infantry, the artillery seemed tireless, the same thunder that had followed them across continents, unbroken in sound or spirit. Each gun had fired thousands of rounds since Normandy, its steel barrel worn smooth by repetition, its crew changed and reduced, but never stilled. The M2 was no longer just a weapon. It was the pulse of an army that had learned to think in range tables and time brackets. By the time the sun broke through the river mist, the Rhine crossings were secure. The bridges swayed with the weight of entire divisions. The German army was retreating east, its fortresses behind it now shattered, its strongholds reduced to memory. On the western shore, the empty shell casings lay in golden drifts, the physical record of every calculation, every heartbeat, every hour of endurance that had made the impossible possible. and as the columns moved forward into Germany, the guns followed, dragging their spent weight toward another horizon. The road to victory was no longer paved with glory, but with the echo of what it had taken to reach it. A path measured not in miles, but in brass. Beyond the Rhine, only one journey remained, the final march into the heart of a dying empire. May 1945. The guns stopped. For the first time in years, Europe exhaled, a continent of smoke and silence. From the Baltic to the Alps, the echoes faded into distance, and the men who had lived by sound were left standing in a world that suddenly refused to answer back. Across the fields of Germany, the M2 howitzers stood idle in the wet grass, their barrels tilted toward a sky now heavy with peace. The crews sat beside them, unsure of what to do with their hands. For months, their every movement had been guided by rhythm, sight, load, fire, repeat, the eternal pulse of precision and fatigue. Now that rhythm was gone. The noise that once gave their days shape had vanished, leaving behind an emptiness louder than war itself. The men listened to birdsong they had forgotten existed. In the wind, they heard the faint clatter of shell casings, half buried in the mud, relics of a time that had ended only hours before. Some of them ran their palms across the cooling metal of their gun, feeling the scars along the barrel, the dents from years of recoil. It was strange how quickly a weapon could seem like something else, a monument, a memory, an artifact of exhaustion. All around them, the evidence of endurance lay scattered, spent cartridges in drifts, torn notebooks filled with range tables, coffee cups blackened by powder smoke. There was no cheering when the ceasefire came, only a weary stillness, as though even victory required a kind of silence. The men had not won through fury or speed, but by patience, by the discipline to endure longer than the enemy could imagine. The M2s, too, seemed changed. They had spoken across deserts, mountains, and rivers. They had cracked fortresses, shattered walls, erased obstacles built over centuries. Yet now, in this quiet dawn, they were only shapes against the horizon. Their barrels gathered dew instead of smoke. Their trails sank slowly into the grass. For all their noise and terror, they had never truly hated what they destroyed. They had only followed the math of necessity. The soldiers understood that in their own way. For years they had lived as extensions of machinery. One mind split into 9 tasks. One purpose carried on recoil and repetition. Without the command, without the coordinates, the silence felt almost unbearable. They were not yet at peace. They were merely paused. Even as the war ended, its rhythm still echoed inside them, in pulse, in muscle, in memory. Some of the guns were marked for storage, others for scrap. Crews watched as cranes lifted them onto flat cars, bound for depots far from the front. The sound of chains tightening over the carriages was almost ceremonial. One man, a gunner from Aachen, wrote in his notebook, "We used to count shells, now we count hours." It was not grief he felt, only disorientation, the realization that the weapon which had defined his life had no place left to aim. In the years that followed, many of those guns were placed in museums, parks, and memorials, silent guardians of a war that once demanded every ounce of human endurance. Children would climb on them, tourists would pose beside them, and the names stenciled on their sides: Rock Island, Watervliet, Ordnance Department, U.S. Army, would fade under the sun. But the men who had served them never forgot the sound. They could still hear the echo that rolled across fields and cities, not as violence, but as proof of survival. They had learned that war is not won by the loudest weapon, but by the one that keeps firing when all others fail. And when the time for firing passed, that endurance remained, reshaped into memory. As spring spread across the ruins, The grass grew around the silent barrels, and the birds returned to nest where smoke once drifted. In that stillness, the M2 Howitzer, the American cannon that had once shattered walls and defined battles, found its final purpose. It had spoken through thunder. Now, at last, its silence spoke more clearly. The war was over. The gun had said its last word. War ended, but the gun did not. When the smoke cleared over Europe and the Pacific, most weapons of the Second World War were scrapped, their usefulness buried with the age that forged them. But the M2 Howitzer endured. Its steel was too honest, its design too balanced to be replaced. By 1948, the Army gave it a new name, M101I1, yet beneath the designation, it remained the same gun, same 105mm barrel, same split-trail carriage, same unbroken rhythm of reliability. It was a survivor in a world already changing. Jet aircraft ruled the skies, atomic weapons redefined power, and yet, when new wars came, in the frozen valleys of Korea, in the jungles of Vietnam, it was the old gun that returned. From the snowbound ridges of the Chosin Reservoir to the coastal plains near Incheon, its voice was unmistakable, the steady cadence of confidence. The M101A1 fired when others froze, when the cold shattered lesser machines. Its recoil echoed off the mountains like an old promise kept. In Korea, it became the backbone once more, the weapon of choice for every U.S. division from Pusan to the Yalu. When temperatures dropped below zero, men wrapped rags around the breech to keep the metal from tearing skin. When ammunition convoys stalled, they rationed shells as if they were food. Yet the gun always fired. Each shot carried the lineage of North Africa and Normandy, a sound both familiar and reassuring. It was not a relic, it was a reminder that endurance is a kind of genius. 2 decades later, it spoke again. In Vietnam, the jungle swallowed roads, erased maps, and mocked precision. But the 105 could be flown where tanks could not go, broken down and slung beneath helicopters, rebuilt on mountaintops or in the mud. At Khe Sanh, its voice rolled through the fog for 77 days, a heartbeat in a siege where seconds stretched into eternity. The same design that once shattered German fortresses now held off human waves under a different flag, a different generation. The gun outlived those who built it. Its engineers, long retired or gone, had designed for one war and created for a century. By the time new artillery appeared, self-propelled, computerized, automated, the M101A1 was still firing somewhere. It followed America's soldiers wherever they went, from Korea to Laos, from Lebanon to Desert Storm. Even when nations broke apart, when doctrines shifted and empires changed their flags, the M2's descendants remained in service, used by allies, adversaries, and those who simply trusted a tool that never failed. Its shells marked history's turning points. At Incheon, they shattered defenses that opened a new front. At Khe Sanh, they defended a perimeter against annihilation. In the deserts of 1991, they still thundered, older than the men who served them, their barrels worn thin but still steady. It was the same gun in a different age. The echo of the 20th century carried into the 21st. What kept it alive was not modernization, but efficiency. In a world obsessed with invention, the M2 never needed reinvention. Its strength was simplicity, its purpose unchanging. It was not the biggest, fastest, or most advanced. It was merely the most dependable. And that, more than brilliance or beauty, is what survives. By the dawn of the new millennium, the M101A1 had become more than a weapon. It was a relic of craftsmanship, the kind of engineering that measured success not in innovation, but in trust. Around the world, from parades to training grounds, it still fired ceremonial salutes, its thunder reduced to memory, yet no less profound. Machines fade, empires fall, names change, but reliability endures, and in that endurance lies a different kind of immortality. For nearly a century, the gun that won by endurance never truly stopped firing. It simply waited for silence and proved it could still be heard. The M2 Howitzer was never a weapon of glamour. It lacked the menace of the Tiger tank, the mystique of the Spitfire, the spectacle of the bomber. There were no parades for it, no posters, no songs. It did not symbolize victory, it enabled it. It was a weapon built not for admiration, but for endurance, and in that simplicity lay its quiet genius. Across the battlefields of Europe, it proved a truth older than the war itself. Endurance defeats elegance, and precision defeats pride. Germany had built weapons of fear, machines of beauty and brutality, engineered to astonish. America built systems of logistics, communication, and calculation. One relied on craftsmanship, the other on consistency. One fought for perfection, the other for persistence. When those philosophies met, it was not the grand designs that survived, but the steady rhythm of a weapon that never failed. The M2 did not conquer through power alone. Its 105mm shell was modest compared to the massive guns of the Axis. Its range was average, its appearance unremarkable, but its reliability was absolute. Every round fired exactly as intended. Every mechanism functioned in heat, rain, or snow. It did not need brilliance. It needed only to work again and again, without pause. In that repetition, it became more than a machine. It became a language of trust. Germany built fortresses. America built fire plans. While one nation poured concrete, the other drew coordinates. The Reich trusted its walls, thick, immovable, and rooted in the ground. The United States trusted its mathematics, mobile, invisible, and infinitely adaptable. When the walls of Europe met the arithmetic of artillery, stone gave way to calculation. The M2 did not tear down fortresses with brute force, it dismantled them by equation. In that difference lay the future of warfare. The battles of the 20th century had begun with movement, tanks, aircraft, and blitzkrieg. They ended with systems, logistics, computation, and control. The M2 stood at that threshold, the bridge between muscle and mind. Its thunder announced not just the end of an empire, but the birth of a new order, the age of precision. Each shot it fired carried that transition. It was the sound of discipline measured in degrees and seconds, of men who no longer fought by instinct, but by data. It was the hum of radios, the click of slide rules, the scratch of pencils over maps, all converging into a single moment of calculated destruction. By war's end, the Allies no longer won by surprise or speed. They won by knowing exactly where to strike and never missing twice. And when the last fortress fell, when the final barrage faded into silence, the lesson remained. Power alone does not endure. What endures is consistency, the capacity to sustain accuracy, to adapt without breaking. The M2 story was not one of innovation, but of refinement, not of spectacle, but of steadiness. It embodied the principle that victory is rarely sudden. It is accumulated, round by round, through unbroken resolve. In the rubble of Europe's collapsed defenses, that truth was written clearly. The nations that had built walls learned that permanence is an illusion. The nations that built systems learned that order, once achieved, can outlast chaos. The M2 Howitzer had not only ended wars, it had defined how the next ones would be fought. It fired until there were no walls left to crush, and when it finally fell silent, its echo lingered, not in noise, but in understanding. That in war, as in history, the surest weapon is not brilliance or might, but precision that never fails.